Мобильные гуманитарии.
Global aid industry.
Widersprüche des Humanitarismus.
Podrían informar al humanitarismo.
Notion de distance, de proximité et de l'autre.
All right, hello and welcome to the Mobile Humanitarians webinar series. My name is Agnieszka Sobocinska. I'm Associate Professor of History at Monash University in Melbourne. In this series, we're exploring the relationship between humanitarianism and mobility. We're looking at the movement of people, ideas and things, from local settings to international organizations.
My name is Tilman Savlansky and I'm speaking to you from Geneva. I'm an anthropologist at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Chika Watanabe. Chika is a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Manchester, and she's the author of the book Becoming One: Religion, Development and Environmentalism in a Japanese NGO in Myanmar, which was published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2019. In the book, based on long-term fieldwork in Myanmar, Chika draws a really fine-grained picture of the activities and historical connections that this Japanese NGO established between Japan, Myanmar, and other sites around the world. And after Chika's talk, we will have the opportunity to really dive into some of the themes that emerge from the book. Chika is also the co-founder of the collaborative project Patchwork Ethnography, which explores new methodological and theoretical approaches to ethnographic research in a time of increasing limitations on long-term fieldwork. And the project attends to how changing living and working conditions are transforming knowledge production, a topic that has become really pressing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but which has, of course, already been an issue prior, and especially with the rise of the neoliberal university. Now, with these comments and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our guest. Welcome, Chika. We really look forward to discussing with you.
Great, thank you so much. Actually, your mention of patchwork ethnography is a good segue into mentioning that we are actually on strike this week from the 1st to the 3rd of December across a lot of universities in the UK, including Manchester. And the four things that the union and we are fighting for through this strike is one is low pay, that our pay has not kept up with inflation and universities are refusing to negotiate. The second is casualization. I think it's happening all over the world, not just in the UK, but increasingly, short-term contracts, casualized academic labor is becoming the norm, which we're fighting against. And I think that speaks to the, why a lot of academics, ethnographers are unable to do long-term field work because a lot of people can't afford it. Third is workload, especially under the pandemic. I think, again, not just the UK, but I think we've been overworked, and there needs to be some protection around that. And the last fight that we're fighting for is the pay gap, gender, ethnic, and based on disability and so on. There's a huge pay gap across the sector. So yes, I just want to mention that we are on strike with these four fights at the moment.
Thank you, Chika, and on to the talk.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Till and Agnieszka, for the invitation to speak about this topic of mobility and humanitarianism. To be honest, I'd never thought about my project in terms of mobility, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to slice my project in this different way. Before we start, just to make sure that this presentation is accessible to everyone, I'll describe myself. My name is Chika Watanabe, and I'm a senior lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Manchester. I'm a Japanese woman in her early 40s with long black hair And today I'm wearing a cotton long sleeve shirt with a pink pattern that looks a little bit like fireworks against a white background and a dark gray cardigan over that. I'm in my office, and behind me there's a white whiteboard with some mathematical equations, which are not mine. I think there was an economist who used this office before me, and I've just been too lazy to erase it. So when I was preparing this presentation, I asked myself, what is the role of mobility in understandings of humanitarianism? When we think of a humanitarian or a development aid worker, most people probably imagine a white European or American person who can travel across nation-state borders freely and who works in places where the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic differences from the local populations are visibly obvious. And here on the slide, I have an image from the movie Beyond Borders with Angelina Jolie. And she is standing in the rain, obviously a white woman standing in the rain with a queue of Cambodian refugees in the film. So in that sense, mobility and the things that it seems to imply underpin definitions of the humanitarian person. So what does mobility imply in humanitarianism? There's probably a virtue attached to mobility in terms of the humanitarian actor moving towards a distant suffering other, an act of reaching out across difference that is seen to be an ethical act. So in this view, differences in the form of the suffering other versus the compassionate self help define humanitarian action. This principle of creating meaningful connections with strangers across difference is part of the ideology of liberal altruism, as Erica Bornstein described in her book on charity and humanitarianism in India, called Disquieting Gifts. Difference is meaningful in humanitarianism because it's a problem, right? Difference indicates the inequality that needs to be transcended. So it's a problem, but it's meaningful because it gives reason for humanitarian action. According to Didier Fassin, inequality and solidarity are both part of humanitarianism. He writes in his 2012 book, Humanitarian Reason, and this is on page 3, quote, "A remarkable paradox deserves our attention here. On the one hand, moral sentiments are focused mainly on the poorest, most unfortunate, most vulnerable individuals. The politics of compassion is a politics of inequality. On the other hand, the condition of possibility of moral sentiments is generally the recognition of others as fellows. The politics of compassion is a politics of solidarity. This tension between inequality and solidarity, between a relation of domination and a relation of assistance, is constitutive of all humanitarian government," end quote. So our anthropological aim in studying humanitarianism often becomes one of trying to recuperate the better half, right? The solidarity that can emerge from proximity to the suffering other in humanitarian interactions. So in other words, moving across distance and difference in order to establish an intimacy is solidarity, the good part of humanitarianism that we should keep a hold of. But what if solidarity through proximity and similarity are not the answer to unequal relations in humanitarian action? So in the remaining time, I will argue that the language and idea of solidarity is itself part of the mechanism of inequality in certain forms of international aid. Well, in my research, there were two avenues of inquiry that led me to question solidarity. One was through the lens of so-called faith-based development, and the other was through the context of an inter-Asian form of aid. So in other words, working outside secular and Euro-American assumptions forced me to question the good that is usually attached to solidarity. Between 2009 and 2013, I studied one of the oldest NGOs in Japan, the Organization for Industrial, Spiritual, and Cultural Advancement, or OISCA. It was established in 1961 but its beginnings should be traced to decades earlier when its founder, Nakano Yonosuke, established a Shinto-inspired new religious movement called Ananaikyo in the 1930s. So here in this slide, there are two pictures of the Oisuka office in Tokyo. It's a grand white building, and it says Oisuka at the top. It looks a little bit like a school. The second picture is the entrance to the Ananaikyo religious organization's headquarters in Shizuoka. And you can see a traditional Japanese structure with sloping roofs and wooden gate doors. Although Oisuka and Ananaikyo are legally registered as separate entities, the connections between the two are irrefutable, from the people who straddle both organizations and worlds to Oisuka's mission, which reflects its Ananaikyo philosophies. So part of its mission statement reads, quote, "We recognize that all life is closely interconnected and that their source is in the universe. We envision a world in which people coexist beyond differences of nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, and culture to strive to protect and nurture the basis of life on this earth." So I don't have time in this presentation to go into the Ananaikyo teachings reflected here, but just to say that speaking of the universe as the source of life, of all life, is not something that appears in other Japanese NGOs' mission statements. So Oisuka's activities center around agricultural training centers in Japan and across 11 Asia-Pacific countries, such as the Philippines, Bangladesh, Fiji, and Myanmar. And Myanmar is where I did half of my fieldwork. The aim is to teach rural youth skills in organic and sustainable agriculture over the course of a year so that they will go back to their villages and lead a sustainable development and environmental movement. And here I have a slide from one of the training centers in Japan. You see a field of large cabbages, and you see two training centers, I think one from Fiji and the other one from Papua New Guinea, and they're harvesting these cabbages. And you see in the distant background some low mountain ranges, and this is in a rural part of southern Japan. So in addition to agricultural techniques, the staff members of the training centers teach something else that they view to be even more important than agriculture: the value of discipline and the commitment to a collective. This was achieved for an intensely communal lifestyle in which both staff and trainees would share sleeping quarters, communal baths, and the agricultural labor that they did throughout the day, and also collective duties like cleaning the buildings that they had to do every morning, and they would also prepare meals together. One of the most jarring experiences of fieldwork for me were the morning routines at all the training centers that I visited. This is both in Japan and in Myanmar. Everyone would wake up at around 6 a.m. or earlier, clean the bathrooms, hallways, and kitchens in teams of 3 or 4 people, and then we would gather in the courtyard outside. We all wore the same uniform of a dark navy jacket, white exercise trousers, and a white cap. We had to go through a militaristic routine to make sure we were all lined up in neat rows and march up toward the flagpoles to raise the national flags of Japan and that of the trainees using precise movements and verbal commands. So in the slide here, there's a picture of one of these disciplinary morning routines in Japan. It's a row of trainees, I think there are 9 of them, in that uniform of the navy blue jacket, white trousers, actually white shoes as well, white gloves, and white caps. And they're all standing with their left hands on their left hips in order to measure the correct distance between each other, and they're facing the national flags of each of the trainees. Japanese staff members would explain to me that this might seem strange at this day and age in Japan, where disciplinary exercises like these are not common anymore, but that this was important so that trainees and staff could become one, hitotsu ni naru. And that's the title of my book. This ethos of becoming one would instill in everyone the value of thinking with and for the collective, something that would be valuable when trainees return to their villages and try to upstart a grassroots sustainable development movement. So from the perspective of the non-Japanese trainees, it was actually a convincing argument once they saw that the Japanese staff and even the director of the training center would get down on their knees to clean toilets and kitchen floors alongside the trainees. Everybody was in it together. So I should point out that even though Oiska's approach to development aid might seem unique, in my work I argue that it encapsulates a more general understanding of what a Japanese form of aid looks like or should look like. For one, this emphasis on cultivating a certain character as well as skills among aid recipients reflects the Japanese government's focus on human resource development as a form of development aid, or what they call hitozukuri, which I translate literally as making persons. Secondly, Oiska's Japanese staff members explain the emphasis on discipline and communal living, as well as on sustainable and organic agriculture as part of what they describe as Japanese values of collectivism and harmony with the natural world. Archival evidence indicates that since the 1960s, Japanese politicians and bureaucrats embraced this work of Oiska as a form of soft power around the world, imparting Japanese values to other societies. So there's archival evidence of politicians and bureaucrats advocating for Oiska in parliamentary discussions, and so on. And thirdly, the long-term and immersive experience of Japanese staff and non-Japanese trainees living together in the training centers, and the fact that Japanese staff are stationed at training centers overseas for years and often decades, embodies the claim that Japanese approaches to aid do not create a distance with aid recipients, right? Presumably unlike European and American projects, right? You might have come across such claims of Japanese humanitarian workers taking pride in the fact that they live alongside their beneficiaries, unlike, so-called Western aid workers who retreat to their compounds and luxury accommodations at the end of the day. So in all of these ways, we can think of Oiska as a diagnostic tool for wider Japanese ideologies of international aid. So as I mentioned earlier, expat humanitarians are seen to be highly mobile. But there's a difference when it comes to religiously inspired aid workers, types of aid that have often been called faith-based. In a chapter in the book titled Sacred Aid, Bertrand Tate writes that, quote, missionaries have always played the long game. So ordinary NGOs tend to stay in a project site only for a limited time period and live at a distance from local communities. But Christian missionaries have always tended to stay for years in a place deeply embedded in local people's lives, and they learn the local language and so on. Of course, this was always done with the purpose of converting people to Christianity, but years of living together with people also inevitably leads to some proximate and intimate relationships. And so looking at faith-based aid helps us destabilize what proximity and solidarity might mean in humanitarian contexts, not necessarily only good, but also troubling. Although Oiska staff were not Christian missionaries, they did also stay at project sites overseas, so at training centers for many, many years, largely motivated by their commitment to Ananaikyo teachings. These Japanese staff members, all men, who would often marry a local staff member or former trainee and raise children at their training centers, effectively turning their workplaces into their homes. And here on the slide, I have a picture of an example of Oiska staff's long-term commitments. It's the director of one of the training centers in the Philippines. He married a Filipino woman at the training center. And you see, it says, welcome to the 30th anniversary celebration of the Bago Training Center. And this kind of long-term commitment was made particularly noticeable in recent years with the arrival of younger Japanese staff in their 30s and younger who were not from Ananaikyo and were not religious at all and did not believe in staying at a training center for decades. Many of them would tell me that going native, like the older staff, was not appropriate for a development organization. So one of the perspectives that led me to question the virtue, or at least simplicity, that's often assumed about solidarity was the religiously inflected character of Oiska. The second lens that my research offered was that this was an inter-Asian form of aid, since OISCA works primarily in other Asian countries. Although Japan has been included in definitions of the global north and so-called traditional donors since the 1960s, it always had a metaphorical asterisk next to its name, right? It's not a Western European or North American country. It's not a country where Christianity is the dominant religion. And it was a recipient of international aid itself, primarily from 1945 to the 1950s. This Asian and particularly inter-Asian form of aid makes a difference in how humanitarian moral sentiments, broadly conceived, are conceptualized. In thinking through this, it's been helpful to find ethnographic analyses of other Asian forms of aid. So in her 2012 book, Disquieting Gifts, Erica Bornstein found a mode of what she calls relational empathy, without motivated humanitarian action in India. This model is based on social and kin-like obligations and not on the kind of stranger sociality and the suffering distant other that we find in liberal and Christian altruism. Similarly, Carolyn Xu has a 2008 article entitled Rehabilitating Charity in China in the Journal of Civil Society, where she showed that among NGO workers in China, what's valuable in charitable acts are relations of obligation in gift exchange, through which aid recipients are incorporated into kin-like networks. So echoing Bornstein and Xu, I found that the idea of being like family was central to the humanitarian imagination in OISCA, and this had troubling implications. So OISCA's Japanese staff members often talked about the training centers and the organization in general as being like family, or kazoku no yo. And here on the slide, there's a picture of some trainees and staff members sitting down for lunch at one of the training centers in Japan. They are long desks or tables, long tables, where everyone eats communally together. And you see one of them smiling and showing her noodles to the camera. So this idea of being like family referred actually to both blood and affinal ties, as well as metaphorically. Mainly due to the NGO's links to Ananaikyo, it was not uncommon to find a mother and a son, or a father and his children, all working in different parts of OISCA, as they saw this as an extension of their commitment to the religious organization. It was also common to find a Japanese staff member married to a non-Japanese staff member or former trainee, as you saw earlier. And also marriages happened among Japanese staff. So since they all lived together in this intensely communal environment, in many ways, it's not surprising that romance would flourish across different boundaries. But this meant that this ideology of being like family had a particularly compelling ring to it, since many staff members were indeed family in the common sense meaning of the word. In addition, though, being like family was a feeling achieved through the sharing of collective living and labor, or as one Japanese staff member stated, through, quote, eating rice from the same bowl, sweating together. 同じ釜の飯を食って一緒に汗を流して. As Shan Lazar, in her article from 2019 entitled A Kinship Anthropology of Politics in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, she helpfully summarizes anthropologists from Mayor Fortis to Julian Pitt Rivers and later Jane Karsten, how they propose that kinship, or more accurately relatedness, can be achieved through processes of consubstantiality or the sharing of substances, such as through shared eating and shared feeding. Although in my book, I outlined some ways that ideas of relatedness were slightly different for Burmese staff members and trainees, they did generally share the sense of familyness, as many of them told me that what they liked about the OISCA Training Center in Myanmar was that it is like family, mitasulo nelo. And this was largely due to the fact that everyone, from the trainees to the Japanese director, shared in the collective lifestyle and labor. A number of anthropologists have shown that the presence of kinship in the public or even in political realms is not unusual. And in fact, it can play a central role in the making of politics. So Shan Lazar, in her study of labor unions in Argentina, showed how metaphors and practices of kinship create an ethical and political collective. In her 2019 article that I mentioned earlier, she argues that kinship as a concept can be a way to move beyond dominant understandings of politics as motivated by interests. Her ethnography showed that the language of blood and the mobilization of familiar relations in professional spheres, for example, constituted the political movement and collectivity of the trade unions. So in that sense, kinship and politics are inseparable. In a similar vein, Geert de Neve, in an article from 2008 entitled "We Are All Sondukrar, Relatives," in the journal Modern Asian Studied, showed how factory owners in Tamil Nadu in South India mobilized the moral obligations of kinship based on locality, caste, friendship, or blood to discipline its workers. And although this was not always or completely successful, de Neve shows that the language and concept of kinship plays an important role in how urban industry and labor relations function. In addition to shared lives and labor in the training center, the sense of being like family relied on the idea that Japanese aid workers and the aid recipients and local staff from the Asian countries where OISCA operates are culturally similar. And this was a discourse that existed clearly in Japanese views of Burmese people, primarily pointing to the majority Buddhist ethnically Burman people. And in this sense, I should note that the idea of similarity was not uniformly applied to refer to all Asian people in OISCA. And in the slide here, I have a picture from the Myanmar Training Center. It's not about the idea of cultural similarity, but it shows people harvesting rice at the Myanmar Training Center. You see women in straw hats crouching down and cutting the rice and tying them in neat bundles. And everything, it has a golden sort of hue because of the rice having this color at this time of year. So when I spoke to the former director of the Myanmar Training Center, who had been there from 1996 to 2008 when he retired in his 70s, I asked him why he thought the Myanmar Training Center was one of the most successful ones in OISCA. And success here meant that it was mostly self-sufficient and did not need outside funds to operate. He replied, quote, "It's probably because Myanmar is the country in Asia that feels most familiar to Japanese people. Ichiban shitashimi yasui kuni." Dismissing my comment that I'd heard that it was his abilities as a director that led to the success, he explained, quote, "People in Myanmar are extremely hardworking, presumably because they have a strong foundation in Buddhism, something that Japanese people can relate to." Historians of Japanese imperialism, such as Liu Cheng and Jun Uchida, have shown how ideas of Asian commonality and policies of assimilation in the early 20th century confounded intimacy and rule, discrimination and becoming one, submission and belonging in Japanese colonial enterprises, right? The two halves of these binaries were not opposites, right? They worked together. In addition, Japanese imperialism relied on ideas of Pan-Asianism, promoting a unification of Asian people, particularly in opposition to European colonial expansion in Asia, and with Japan at its moral and political center. In considering the language of solidarity as oneness and as being like family in OISCA, and in Japanese aid in Asia in general, we cannot ignore these legacies. There is an intimate imperialism at play in aspirations of oneness. So what this historical context shows us is that kinship as a characteristic of and a metaphor for relations in aid enables the coexistence of inequality and solidarity without it being a paradox. So the idea of what I call solidarity as oneness enacted through kinship was precisely what enabled unequal relations to be naturalized and unproblematized in Noiska. In other words, everyone participated equally in the making of the collectivity in the training centers, but the hierarchical relationship between the director and the trainees, for example, was not questioned. Neither were the inequalities between the Japanese staff and the non-Japanese staff, between some Asian participants versus other Asian participants, right? Those kinds of inequalities were never problematized or questioned. It's important to note that kinship is not a given, right? The work of kinning, as Signe Howell would say in her study of making kin in adoptions, right, takes effort. And I could see that in the difference in relationship between the former director of the Myanmar Training Center and Burmese staff and the relationship between the new director and the Burmese staff. And I was in Myanmar in 2010 and 2011 after the former director retired, so I only heard rumors from the Burmese staff, but everyone loved and respected him, right? This man in his 70s, this Japanese man in his 70s, for his agricultural skills, his long-term commitment to the country, and for his interactions with the Burmese staff and trainees like a father or grandfather. He would run the training center based on emotions, care, and his own discretionary decisions about various issues. In contrast, the new director was a man in his 30s, a Japanese man in his 30s, who had different ideas about how to run the training center and an NGO. He wanted to rationalize operations and keep meticulous records of farm produce and finances and manage budgets through a transparent accounting system. So here on the slide, you see a picture of one of the Burmese staff. He was in charge of the poultry. He's got a big calculator in front of him and 3 notebooks with tables and handwritten notes, which is the record of the number of eggs that chicken have produced, how much he sold, the budget, and so on. So words like management and accountability peppered this new Japanese director's explanations of the visions that he had for the training center. While I appreciated his reasoning, it was clear that it alienated the Burmese staff who did not see this director in kin-like terms. They still talked about the training center as being like family, but the new director did not quite fit in the eyes of the Burmese staff. They seemed to feel his domination strongly and resented it. Unlike the former director, who actually kept control of everything, the new director had given Burmese staff more power over various aspects of the running of the organization, but they did not see this as a leveling move. They often complained about his hierarchical and domineering manner. In my reading, it was the fact that ideas of kinship were no longer effective that inequalities surfaced as problems. So provincializing Euro-American and Christian forms through this Japanese case helps us re-theorize humanitarianism. The coexistence of inequality and solidarity is not a paradox when the humanitarian imagination is based on kinship. If that is the case, the question is not how do we center solidarity as a way to tackle the unequal relationships of aid, such as between the aid worker and aid recipients or between the expat and the local aid worker. Right? The question is, what kinds of mutual obligations condition relations of care and non-care? And how do we mobilize those obligations to make a better world? Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for your talk, Chika. That was really excellent. And I'm going to try to get the discussion going. Well, in your talk, but also I think in quite a bit of your published work, you really try to add nuance to the definition of humanitarianism. And I think that's a really important aspect of your contribution. And in many ways, I think you argue that for a long time, scholars have sort of tended to examine Euro-American forms of humanitarianism as mostly being about the suffering of distant strangers and also the forging of relations of solidarity as the final aim, however disputed that is. And really in contrast, I think you argue that to understand this specific form of Japanese humanitarianism in Asia, we need to kind of flip this logic and understand that the starting point for Japanese aid actors in Asia is not the difference and distance, but its similarity and oneness. Now, equally much research on Western humanitarianism points to the really important legacy of colonialism. And you mentioned that briefly in your talk as well, in sort of creating ideas of the distant others. And I really wonder how this plays out in your case. How do you explain the role of Japanese imperialism in forging ideas of oneness?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, this legacy of imperialism, colonialism is something that I really struggled with in my research and in my analysis. One, because my background is in working with humanitarian organizations in Japan that were established more recently, so in the 90s, for example. And those organizations tend to have younger people, women mostly, who are who have gotten, they're Japanese, but have gotten degrees in Europe or the US. So they have this international view. And so the idea of imperialism, colonialism never appeared in my experience. So when I first started doing research on this organization, I was really surprised by some of the discourses that the older staff members at least would use, such as in World War II, Japanese people went with guns, but now we're going in with our agricultural tools, and we're trying to do the kinds of liberation of Asian people that we couldn't do during the Second World War. Or so there was a lot of references to Japanese imperialism, and to try arguments about seeing it in a positive light, talking about how the Japanese education system now demonizes Japan in the Second World War, and so we need to rethink that, and these textbooks need to be changed. And so there was a lot of talk around that kind of view among the senior staff at the organization. So I really struggled with what to do with that. And I think I still struggle with it, but the way that I've thought about it is that it's both, it's troubling, obviously, but it's also clearly meaningful for a lot of people who are involved in the work. So yes, obviously part of it is about colonizing other parts of Asia, but there was something about this feeling of, or this idea of intimacy or becoming one with other Asian people that gave the senior staff members at least a sense of purpose for why they were doing what they were doing. And so I think I've always been interested in motivations, and I realize that's something that I'm still interested in, why people choose to help others, or why people choose to work for justice, and so on. And so I think some of that is historically conditioned, and part of it is troubling. And those motivations are very difficult to slot into either good good visions or bad visions. I think it's all very complicated. And so I think considering the legacies of colonialism, imperialism, it's not just about how it replicates power inequalities and domination, but it's also about how our desires to do good and help others is also conditioned by those histories.
Chika, that's really interesting. And I was wondering if I could maybe pick that up and push a little bit further. Just listening to your answer, Till's question, I was wondering to what extent you thought, looking at this model of kinship, which is clearly so important to Oiskar, to what extent do you think, and I know that you picked this up in the talk a little bit, do you think those models of kinship and the idea of, I suppose, a family is a way in which Japanese NGOs can sort of tame but also model that colonial past. So the idea that it in some sense replicates models of colonial authority, in which, the family, the Japanese are the senior, so the parents who are, I suppose, teaching the subordinate trainees who are supposedly assume, I guess, the childlike role. What are your thoughts on that? Am I pushing this a bit too far? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that is definitely part of the, I guess, the effect of using the kinship model or metaphors of being like family. That it is based on a hierarchical view. It's about, yeah, the Japanese being the parent teaching the children, and I think staff members talked about their work in that sense. But what I found interesting is that using the metaphor of family makes it seem okay that there's a hierarchy, that it becomes normalized and, accepted. And again, I found that really interesting and troubling at the same time, right? On the one hand, yeah, very disturbing that, there's this paternalistic, very clear hierarchical relationship. At the same time, it wasn't just the Japanese staff, but the Burmese staff, the trainees also found it meaningful that, they didn't question the hierarchy, right? What they questioned were different things. I've talked about this in other articles as well, but and I tried to, in my analysis, yes, show that there is something problematic in that mode, but also take seriously the fact that actually neither the Japanese nor the Burmese staff challenged the hierarchical aspect of it. That's not where the problem was for them. But yeah, definitely, I think the kinship model does replicate that sort of hierarchical model that, it's, yeah, in some ways colonial.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting. I suppose it actually leads into the next question I was going to ask. Sorry, I hope you don't mind, Till. Which was this idea of categories, I suppose, of that tension between difference and similarity. When you were describing Oiska's idea of the connection being, at the level of the universe, so sort of, even beyond species, but certainly at species level, these sort of very broad categories. But then also this idea, this, I suppose, Japanese cultural ideas of Pan-Asianism, or that a sense that somehow Japanese aid was more similar, or Japanese culture was more similar than Western cultures and Western humanitarian. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about those scales and those categories, and how you thought people made sense of similarity and difference being inscribed in these different ways simultaneously, it seems.
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I think I think there was a continuum, or I don't know what the right way to describe it would be, but because there was this idea about similarity and familiarity with particular Asian societies and peoples like Burmese. But for example, Bangladeshis were seen as more a little more different, and therefore more difficult to do the projects there. And and Islam, Muslim practices were also seen as too different sometimes for them. So yeah, there was definitely this continuum that people were always trying to calibrate, I suppose. But yeah, that's a really good question, because I never thought about the idea of the cultural similarity that people talked about with the universe, with the sort of cosmic vision that the religious actors had. Because that, I guess, yeah, I guess that wasn't so much about similarity, but it was about everybody belonging to this great spirit of the universe. We're all one because we're all part of this, natural, not even the natural world, it's the universe with stars and all of that, that we are all part of that cosmic system. But it's a good, yeah, I actually don't have a good answer about how those things would map on. But I think in the end, I think it mapped, you know, I think they probably made sense of it in the sense that even if there are slight differences among cultures and species, or, you know, gender was another one, but it was seen as all playing their part in this cosmic unity. So yeah, good question though.
I have a follow-up question on precisely that aspect, and maybe also the, you know, the religious aspects of OISCA. As far as I understood, the history of the organization is not extremely long. So there is clearly kind of an integration into global trends of I guess new religious movements, etc., that we could observe here. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how OISCA is kind of globally positioned in that, in the light of its history, and how it maybe also thereby relates to global ideas of humanitarianism precisely via that trajectory.
Mm. Yeah, you know, it's a little complicated in the sense that so Oiska people very much distinguish themselves from Ananaikyo, the religious group. You know, it's the same founder, and he founded Ananaikyo first, and then Oiska came after. But you know, legally they're separate, and so they are, you know, they are quite careful about making sure that they are different, and so so Ananaikyo doesn't, you know, it's quite a small new religious movement, and they don't right now do international work. Right? Oiska is the arm that does the international work, and you know, non-religious, I guess, not secular, but you know, non-religious work. And at the beginning, I think as I explained in my book, you know, at the beginning, Yonosuke wanted to create a global movement of religious leaders who work towards, you know, international peace. And so that was the ethos of the movement at the beginning. But for one reason or another, you know, he decided that religious leaders were fighting too much, according to stories from staff members. And so he wanted to establish a sort of different organization that would work specifically on agriculture, addressing hunger and sustainability and so on. And so that became the international arm of it. But because of the religious the religious international conferences that they still had relationships with various people around the world. So there is an Oiska international movement that's separate from the NGO, and there are branches all over the world. And so there's a listserv where they share ideas and activities in some ways, and they're affiliated with each other. And so it's not, and that sort of global connection is a lot more around environmental ideas, and not necessarily humanitarianism in terms of addressing suffering in that sense, but a lot of that discussion is about sustainability, Mother Earth, or the spiritual discussions around what it means to be connected to nature. Tree planting, a lot of those activities are around planting trees and deforestation and so on. So there's an environmental movement that it links to, but yeah, not necessarily humanitarian. At the same time, so there's that aspect. On the other hand, though, I think Oiska was it was very very early on, when there were no other NGOs in Japan. It linked up with the UN, and got recognition as as an NGO, international NGO, by the UN. And so it slotted itself into an international global circuit of NGOs that are officially recognized, which happened a lot earlier than in other other organizations in Japan.
I think I asked two in a row, Till. Would you like to have the chance to also ask two in a row?
Yeah, of course. I think another really interesting aspect of your work that perhaps goes a little bit beyond the talk as well, and I think is quite prominent in your book, is the aspect of the transfer of concepts, which of course is also related to mobility in many ways. And specifically, you talk about the transfer of concepts from Japan to Myanmar, and then of course also far beyond, I guess, within the framework of OISCA. What I was particularly fascinated by, especially when reading your book, was the concept of furusato, which is, as far as I understood, sort of the imaginary of a universal home. And if I remember correctly, the idea of this imaginary universal home emerged in Japan as specifically as the idea of a sort of in a rural context as an idyllic place that one sort of defines as home. And through OISCA's work, this sort of traveled through development work to Myanmar more in the sense of an inner home. Now, perhaps you could talk a little more about the concept and the role it plays in establishing connections between Japan and yeah, perhaps other places, because I think the mobility of concepts is also really important in the context of mobile humanitarians.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think it's so furusato is in Japanese, it as I describe in the book, it alludes to this landscape of rice paddies, a village, nestled between mountains, very traditional practices still continuing, the extended family as being the unit that's important there, everybody sharing in their collective work, living in harmony with nature and so on. So there is this image of furusato. It means home as well. But obviously most people don't have a home like that, so it's an imaginary sort of thing. And I think if you watch any Hayao Miyazaki sort of Princess Mononoke, Totoro, like all of those anime movies, that's furusato. I think Hayao Miyazaki actually rides on the idea of furusato as well. And so there's this sort of and I think it exists in other societies as well in its own form, this sort of pastoral imaginary of a time in the past when things were perfect or harmonious in terms of family relationships, societal relationships, and relationships with nature. And it's interesting to me how and it was interesting to me how this this concept that seems to hark back to a kind of pastoral past, that becomes the image of the future that this organization wanted to put forward. And so for as I explained in one of my earlier articles, it's it's this past that the Japanese staff, the senior staff at least, would argue has been lost in Japan because of modernization and industrialization. And so they spoke about protecting the furusato in Asian countries because those countries have not been developed yet. So we can still, we can still protect their harmonious existence with nature and so on. And for, I think, the Burmese staff that I talked to, it was, I think it was about, protect, I think they had a similar sort of view of, protecting this sense of home that we have, and we shouldn't lose it even if Myanmar becomes developed and modernized and industrialized. But at the same time, it was a word that allowed, maybe this gets to that question of scaling, but it allowed the, everyone involved to be able to map on the training center to larger scales of the idea of home. And so they talked about the training center as furusato. So a lot of the Burmese staff would talk about the training center as furusato, and they had a cafe where they sold the breads that they made, cakes that they made, and the cafe was now called furusato. And so I think the idea of furusato also allowed them to envision that this training center was a model for how they could actualize this global form of furusato. Obviously, it was the mechanisms for scaling up were not clear, and it didn't actually, it was always a challenge to do that. But I think it allowed them to stay motivated and find meaning in what they did, because it was this utopia sort of that they created in the training center that they imagined to be the precursor to a utopia that they could create globally.
That's so interesting. Chika, could I just ask you, you mentioned gender before. Would you mind expanding how you see gender working within these models of kinship, within familial models, in Oyska, but also about power and cultural power, geopolitical power, literally economic power in these relationships as well? How does gender fit in or disrupt the other ways in which difference and power and mobility were communicated?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and something that I, didn't go into in my book, and I think it's one of the things that I could have done better. And it's one of the and gender is one of the things that, again, I mean, many things that troubled me or confused me during my ethnographic research, but definitely the gendered aspect was one of them, because I would go to the training centers in Japan and expecting to learn agricultural techniques and sustainable methods, but they would often put me in the kitchen. And so while the trainees and staff were doing agricultural stuff outdoors, often I helped out in the kitchen to make lunch or dinner or whatever. And I always wondered why. At first it didn't click. I was like, why am I in the kitchen? And then I realized, oh, right, because I'm a Japanese woman. And so the staff, the director, and all of them, they assumed that, I could help out in the kitchen. I mean, it's great that they thought I could help out. And I could, but I realized early on that there is a very, very gendered aspect to the way that the training center was run. And also the female the female trainees there was a track that I don't talk about in my book or my work, but there were the agricultural trainees, but there were also trainees in Japan that were, what was the word? I can't remember. It was like domestic training, basically. So they came to Japan to learn things like Japanese cooking, flower arrangement, tea. Oh no, I think it might be Amazon delivery. Do you guys, can I step out?
Of course, this is the Zoom generation.
I'm so sorry, hold on.
I'm assuming this is the point where you pause.
It's also a great ethnographic artifact of the pandemic, I guess. So
Yes,
we'll just leave it in.
Fantastic. Well, these are the production decisions we'll be wrestling with.
You're okay if we leave that in just as an ethnographic artifact? You're okay with that? What did you get delivered?
I think my partner ordered some records. So there's some,
well, that's
we're not
nice.
even mean. So there's some records. Oh my gosh. I know sometimes they just knock and yeah. What's it? Oh, gender, right? So yeah, so there was this so there were these, women, female trainees who came and learned about basically domestic skills. And it was very clear, so the Oyska staff did talk about gender equality, and we need more women to become directors of the training centers, because when I was there, and I imagine it's the same now too, but there are 4 training centers in Japan. Only I think one of them had recently had a woman as a director. And then out of the dozens of training centers around the Asia Pacific region, I think they're all men, and they were all in their 60s or 70s. And so there was talk in the organization that we need to get more women to do it. And I know that Oyska, a friend who did stuff with some diplomats in DC, told me that he saw Oyska's name there as a representative of gender equality and efforts and all of that. But I know that, for them, gender equality, I mean, the way that they talked about it, gender equality was always discussed in terms of separate but equal. So they would say, women have, their own roles, they have their own roles, men have their own roles, and together, we create a unit sort of discussion. So yeah, I mean, again, it's about difference and similarity, I guess, it's about difference, but they all work together. Yeah,
and allowing it to sort of make sense of being a gender equal organization that has separate domestic tracks for women. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Do you, Agnieszka, allow me to ask a final question, because I think we're slowly getting towards the end of our time, and just to sort of get back a little bit on the mobility question and maybe tie that in with the gender discussion that we just had, is maybe kind of a bit of a general question to you, Chika, sort of to end with. Perhaps like based on your research, do you think that mobility for humanitarian purposes does replicate gendered standards of behavior that perhaps have already been there in certain contexts? Or is it exactly kind of the friction of these cross-cultural encounters that really problematizes gender relations and also allows for a certain type of redrawing of these roles with regard to OISCA, but maybe more generally in humanitarian contexts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hadn't thought of mobility in the humanitarian context in terms of gender. But I guess it makes me think of, the relationship between immobility and mobility, because there are, I mean, as a lot of scholars of humanitarianism have talked about, there are certain people in the humanitarian sector who are seen to be mobile and are mobile, and then others who are not mobile, who are immobile, seen to be so and are in fact immobile. And so I think, in OISCA, but maybe in other, I don't know if it's in other contexts, but at least in OISCA, because of the expectation that women take care of the household and raise the children, all of that, I think that made them immobile in terms of the organization, and therefore they had less prestige in the organization, I suppose. I mean, I think there was a gender aspect, but there were also men who were, I described some of these, older men who, for one reason or another, had never been given posts overseas. So they were also not mobile, but we didn't know why, right? Because decisions were made in sort of in a black box. But there was definitely a gendered aspect to it. But I think that speaks to wider, Japanese problems of Japanese misogyny and sexism, right? A lot of women in a few years, a lot of women are not given, for example, the higher positions in a company because they assume that if this woman gets married and have children, they assume she's going to quit her job or not be able to work as hard. So it's not just OISCA. I think it's a wider problem. But in terms of the larger humanitarian sector, in terms of mobility and all of that, I think it's hard to generalize, I suppose, because it depends on the various sexist gendered assumptions of who gets to move and who is seen as being less mobile, but also should be less mobile because they should be taking care of children or so on. But I think there is definitely those kinds of assumptions that shape who is seen to be mobile and who isn't.
Right, Agnieszka, do you have anything you would like to add at this point?
No, but I did just want to, I know you'll be saying more formal thanks, but just wanted to thank you, Chika. That was just so wonderful to have that discussion.
Yeah,
so personal little thanks.
Oh, no, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chika. It was really a pleasure to discussing with you and to learning more about your research. And I'm sure our audience will enjoy listening to or watching the webinar equally.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.